Hi folks, so since I've started putting videos up more regularly on this YouTube channel, I've noticed that a lot of people subscribing and even commenting are not people from a HEMA background, that is historical European martial arts, which is what I do and my club does. That's an interesting thing. It's not what I expected. I didn't expect so many non-HEMA people to be interested. So for the benefit of you, I thought I should explain what historical European martial arts, which we call HEMA for short, or historical fencing, it actually is. Okay, so what it is we run martial arts classes or fencing classes, depending how you look at it and what weapons you're focusing on, where we base what we teach on actual sources that describe techniques and philosophy behind fighting and actual the mechanics themselves and also the principles underlying those mechanics. And if you go to the Scholar Forum, which I run, or Sword Forum, or the HROR, which is HEMA Resources website, or Wiktor now, for example, you can find lots of these online sources, and there's literally hundreds of them. From the medieval period, we've got sort of 100 or so, I think in that sort of number, of known technical sources. Generally speaking, with each century that goes past the 15th century, with the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, you get more and more treatises, which are often known as manuals on the internet, although most of them aren't technically manuals, they are treatises, but that's a semantic difference. You get more and more of these manuals generally as you go later in time. That's not to say that necessarily more were written, although in most cases that's probably the case, but also partly because obviously the further back you go in time, the less survived. So we essentially go away and we study these old treatises and sources, and we then in our classes we practice the techniques and practice what's taught in these books, and we do that in several different ways. One is by slowly going through, like you would do in a karate class or a jiu-jitsu class. We slowly go through the moves and work out the logic of, if a person attacks with this type of attack, then you defend in this way, and then you counter-attack them with this or that. So we work out the mechanics of the system, and then as we start to work that out, and obviously most of us running big groups started this many years ago. Once we start to work that out, you start to see the underlying principles and get a deeper understanding of these sources, and then you can start pressure testing them, which essentially means you can start sparring. Okay, so we use the term sparring. Traditionally, sparring is a term which is mostly used for boxing, actually. So some people don't like the term sparring and they say free play or just fencing instead. But we start essentially fighting in a controlled way, and the important part of that is we put fully protective gear on, usually. So we wear fencing masks, padded jackets, as you see in the videos on this channel, and then we use different types of sparring weapons in order to that we can do the techniques in the way it's shown in the book and under pressure in a competitive situation, and hit the opponent without actually wounding them. So clearly they're usually blunt weapons, usually with a safe tip and obviously safe edges, and usually they're made more flexible than the real thing as well. So when you thrust someone, it doesn't just break their ribs, but it actually bends in the blade and so on. And I should also add that some people do training with sharp swords. As you can see in some of my videos, we do test cutting, which not only is good fun, but also teaches you good principles of how actually to cut, rather than just how to hit someone with a blunt weapon, which is very different to cutting someone with a sharp weapon. It's a different body mechanic. And some people even do practice drills and even very controlled sparring with sharp weapons. And also some people spar with safe weapons but with much less protective gear on, just being more careful. So there's many types of training, and this is what links into the video I put up called The Great Triangulation, which is a way of plotting all of these points around a kind of central truth to get a better perspective on the reality of combat. I should also add, as well as covering a period from the earliest source, which is I-33, which dates to about 1300 AD. It goes all the way through. We generally class HEMA as running up to about 1945. In actual fact, it just becomes a debate of what you class as historical. Some people might class that as World War I or 1900 or whatever, but that's subjective. So historical European martial arts. They're European sources. They are martial arts, and martial art can refer to any fighting art with or without weapons, and they are historical. In other words, they're from a historical source and they're documented. We do not, as much as possible, we do not make up anything. We try and source everything we do so that it has a basis in history. Years ago, many people were reconstructing fighting styles without studying these books, and of course they came up with things that looked very different to what's actually shown in these old manuals. And the reason being, of course, because you can never create that situation. You can never recreate the medieval world and be a medieval person and train in the way they trained, with the same mentality that they trained in, with the same end test, i.e. fighting in war or fighting in a duel, that they can. So clearly the most honest way to reconstruct historical combat techniques is to look at historical sources. Two things I also want to mention. It doesn't only involve weapons. I personally focus on weapons, but many people are doing really fantastic HEMA, looking at wrestling and pugilism and unarmed arts. Equally, there's knife fighting, there's unarmed defense against knife. So, you know, there's a lot more out there than just the sword stuff or the stuff that you see most of on the internet. So I hope that's given a little glimpse into what HEMA is. I should also, the other thing I wanted to mention was that there are people who reconstruct weapon styles from periods that we don't have sources for. For example, Viking combat. And I prefer to term that experimental archaeology, because you could call it HEMA, but the problem is there's no real sources for it. Yes, you can look at the Icelandic sagas and other texts that we have, but they're not technical sources that describe techniques and fencing and fighting principles. So I think that they're more likely to diverge from what was actually done in period. However, what's really cool is when people look at these older periods of fighting, and they look at also the medieval and the documented fighting traditions, and they marry those two together to try and get closer to the truth. And that again is part of this triangulation that I talked about. So yeah, there's lots of HEMA clubs all over the world. Just search either for historical European martial arts in the area that you live in or study in or work in, or historical fencing. Same thing on YouTube, searching for HEMA or historical European martial arts or historical fencing is what will yield you the best results. And yeah, go out there, find a HEMA club and get training. Cheers.